The Ford Pinto is one of the most infamous cars in automotive history. Introduced in 1970, just prior to the first OPEC oil embargo and the gas crisis that followed, the Pinto was initially a huge success for Ford, with sales of more than 800,000 units in its first 2 years. Then, on May 28, 1972, Lilly Gray was driving her 6-month-old Pinto down a stretch of California's Interstate 15 when the engine stumbled and stalled. A 1962 Ford Galaxie braked hard and rear-ended the Pinto, which suddenly burst into flames. Gray escaped the car but died of her injuries soon after. Her passenger, 13-year-old Richard Grimshaw, suffered burns over 90% of his body. It was the first of many fiery wrecks involving the Ford Pinto, incidents that resulted in over 100 lawsuits that would cost Ford dearly, both in money and reputation. So, how did the Pinto come to be? And how did it come to be so dangerous? In this video, we're going to find out more about Ford's first subcompact car that tragically became famous for the wrong reasons. Small imports, most notably the Volkswagen Beetle, had been growing in popularity in America since the 1950s, but it wasn't until the late 60s that Detroit started to take the threat seriously. General Motors invested heavily in the Vega, hoping to steal a technical march on Ford. Strapped for cash, AMC developed the low-cost and largely successful Gremlin. Chrysler decided to import cars from Mitsubishi and Hillman. Ford, meanwhile, was stymied by infighting. Seaman Bunky Knudsen, late of GM and now Ford's president, wanted to focus on larger, more profitable models, while Leah Iacocca, VP of Ford's North American operations, argued for a subcompact car. Iacocca won and initiated a rush program to build a car that would come in under £2,000 and $2,000, about $15,000 in 2024 dollars. The Pinto was developed in just over 2 years, far shorter than the 43-month development cycle typical for Detroit. One way Ford engineers saved time was to use components and know-how from Ford's European operations. The rear axle was from the German-designed Capri, already sold in the U.S. as a Mercury. The base engine came from the British Ford Anglia, and the optional engine was part of a new engine family being developed in Germany. To keep weight down, engineers simply lopped off the rear of the car along with much of its underlying structure. Traditionally, engineering is completed before tooling for a new vehicle is created, but as part of the Pinto's crash schedule, tooling and engineering took place simultaneously, which made changes difficult and expensive. Iacocca was famously inflexible on anything that might delay the program. In the 1977 article Pinto Madness, a devastating and in places exaggerated exposé of the Pinto's dangers, an engineer told the magazine Mother Jones, whenever a problem was raised that meant a delay on the Pinto, Lee would chomp his cigar, look out the window, and say, "Read the product objectives and get back to work." In the end, he met his goals. When the 1971 Pinto made its debut, it weighed 1,949 pounds with a base price of $1,919. Ford introduced the Pinto in sedan and hatchback models. Body shape was the same, but the trunk opening differed. Ford added a 2-door wagon, the Pinto Squire, in 1972, and a more luxurious version, the Mercury Bobcat, in 1975. The Pinto's fuel tank was placed right behind the rear axle, with the fuel filler in the left rear quarter panel. When the Pinto was rear-ended, even at a moderate speed, the fuel tank was driven into the rear axle, which had protruding bolts on the back of the differential housing that would puncture the tank. This wasn't a problem on the Capri, which had its gas tank located above the axle. Additionally, the fuel filler neck could tear out of the tank. The resulting fuel spill could be ignited in several ways: sparks from the crash, a lit cigarette inside the car, or by the car that struck the Pinto as it drove into the spray of spilled fuel. Potentially catching on fire wasn't the Pinto's only problem. Its rear-end structure wasn't designed to properly absorb hard impacts, and the buckling floor pan would separate from the rear fenders, allowing fuel and flames into the Pinto's cabin. Furthermore, body deformity could jam the door shut, preventing escape from the burning Pinto and making rescue more difficult. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration investigated rear-end collisions involving 1970 to 76 Ford Pintos and Mercury Bobcats, resulting in fuel spillage and fire. NHTSA concluded that 27 Pinto occupants had died in these crashes, and a further 24 Pinto occupants sustained non-fatal burn injuries. Ford reported fatalities in other vehicles, presumably the cars that struck the Pinto, but NHTSA did not quantify fire-related deaths in other vehicles involved in the collisions. These numbers are much lower than were commonly reported. In Pinto madness, Mother Jones estimated that at least 500 people had been killed in Pinto crashes, and speculated that the number could be as high as 900. Author Peter Wyden, in his book The Unknown Iacocca, repeated the claim of Jim Musselman, an attorney who worked with Ralph Nader, that almost 900 people had been killed in Pinto crashes resulting in fire. Ford was aware of the Pinto's propensity to catch fire. Early crash tests performed in anticipation of a proposed safety standard regarding rear-end collisions and fuel leakage showed the Pinto was prone to fuel leakage and fire in low-speed rear-end impacts. Ford considered several fixes, including a shield behind the axle and a rubberized bladder for the fuel tank, but rejected these as they would have added cost and put the program behind schedule. According to the Unknown Iacocca, 117 lawsuits were brought against Ford for Pinto-related injuries or deaths. There is no record of how much Ford paid out, though in the case of Richard Grimshaw, Lilly Gray's 13-year-old passenger, in 1978, the jury awarded him $2.8 million in compensatory damages and $125 million in punitive damages, the latter reduced to $3.5 million by the judge. After that verdict, Ford settled most of the rest of the Pinto cases out of court. In 1979, the state of Indiana indicted Ford on 3 counts of reckless homicide after a fiery Pinto wreck killed 3 teenagers. This was the first time a corporation faced criminal charges for a defective product. Ford was acquitted. It wasn't until the 1977 model year that federal standards required cars to withstand a 30-mile-per-hour rear-end impact with no fuel leakage. New Pintos were modified with a strengthened fuel filler neck and plastic shielding to protect the fuel tank from damage. In mid-1978, Ford finally agreed to recall all 1971 to 1976 Pinto and 1975 to 76 Mercury Bobcat sedans and hatchbacks. Wagons did not have the same vulnerability. The Pinto was initially a strong seller, with over 350,000 built for the 1971 model year and nearly 500,000 in 1972 and again in 1973. Thanks in no small part to the OPEC oil embargo of 1973 to 74, the Pinto had its best ever year in 1974 with 544,209 sales. But this was around the time that news of the fire started hitting the headlines, and in 1975 sales tumbled by more than 50% to just under 224,000. Bad publicity dogged the Pinto, particularly the aforementioned Motor Jones article, and sales never recovered. In 1981, when Ford introduced the Pinto's front-wheel drive successor, it had a new name, Escort. In recent years, Ford has brought back some of its older nameplates, most notably the Maverick, first applied to a strong-selling 1970s-era compact sedan introduced a year before the Pinto. However, given the Pinto's tarnished reputation, it's highly unlikely Ford will ever revive the Pinto name.